This is hereby given to the members of the commission and to the general public that at this regular meeting, the commission may vote to go into executive session, which will not be open to the public, for legal advice and discussion with the city's attorneys for legal advice on any item listed on the following agenda pursuant to ARS subsection 38-431.03A3. Item number 2 is roll call, and I'll turn it over to Adriana to do that.
Sounds great. Kevin Bond,
Here.
Eric Brownfield,
Here.
Tyler Denham,
Here.
Kevin Dobie, Karen Flores,
Here.
Sandy Flores, Jackie Kellogg,
Here.
Devonna McLaughlin,
Here.
Moses Milazzo, Moses, Corey Rummy,
Here.
Ross Schaefer, Ross. Moses is here. Glenn Slivers, Bailey DeRoya. Back to you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Item number 3 is our land acknowledgement, and I will ask if any commissioners would like to volunteer to read the land acknowledgement. Thank you, Commissioner Rungy.
The Housing Commission humbly acknowledges the ancestral homelands of the area's indigenous nations, original stewards. The lands still inhabited by native descendants border mountains sacred to their indigenous people. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their continued contributions. We celebrate their past, present, and future generations who will forever know this place as home.
Thank you very much. Item number 4 on our agenda is public comments. At this time, any member of the public may address the commission on any subject within their jurisdiction that is not scheduled before the commission on that day. Due to open meeting laws, the commission cannot discuss or act on items presented during this portion of the agenda. To address the commission on an item that is on the agenda, please wait for the chair to call for public comment at the time the item is heard. Do we have anyone here for public comment? Anyone online for public comment, Adriana?
I'm not seeing any comments or raised hands.
Okay. Pause for dramatic effect. All right. We will move on then to item number 5, which is the approval of minutes. The 5A is consideration and approval of minutes for the Housing Commission meeting dated December 19th, 2024. We are asking of the commission to approve the minutes from December 19th, 2024 Housing Commission meeting, which was in the agenda packet. Does anyone have a motion to approve the minutes?
I move to approve the December minutes.
Thank you, Commissioner Flores. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Kellogg. Any comments, discussion, changes? Anyone wants to recommend? Anyone online? All right, seeing none, all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Excellent, that motion carries, and we'll move on to item 6A, which is action items. Super easy because there's none. So we'll move then on to item number 7, presentation and discussion items. 7A is a presentation from the Northern Arizona Association of Realtors, and I believe I'm turning it over to Michelle Linton. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am Michelle Linton, the president of Northern Arizona Association of Realtors, and it's an honor to be speaking on behalf of our association today. To all of you on the Housing Commission, I'd like to express just gratitude for your time and effort and volunteering to be here for our community. We are all in this together when it comes to addressing Flagstaff's housing needs, much like a tight-knit community working to ensure a stronger future for all. Our association's goal is to increase the availability of all housing types especially starter homes, in a way that's both efficient and responsive to the urgency of our housing emergency. It's imperative that we prioritize this issue, and we believe the Housing Commission plays a crucial role in shaping the policies and actions needed to move us forward. As we collaborate, it's important that we encourage city staff to provide the Housing Commission with the time and resources it needs to conduct thorough research, invite expert testimony, and make informed recommendations to the city council. It's crucial this happens before any city department proceeds with a recommendation to council that could impact the cost of housing. We want to ensure the commission has the opportunity to weigh in. It's essential for city staff to understand the importance of increasing engagement of their departments with the Housing Commission. We are thankful that city staffers are conducting the last step study and look forward to its findings. As our city grows, it's necessary that we focus on making housing more accessible for all, especially the first responders, teachers, nurses, first home buyers, and everyday residents who make Flagstaff home. With Phoenix becoming hotter and more crowded, we know that second home buyers are increasingly looking at Flagstaff. These homes, while valuable, can contribute to a housing shortage because we only have so much finite land that we can build upon due to our location being bordered by Forest Service and state land. We need to help our community understand that infill and density are smart growth strategies for our mountain town. In fact, EPA studies show that a compact, walkable communities with higher density can reduce vehicle emissions to 40%. Together, we can ensure that Flagstaff remains a place where our community members can afford to live. Let's work toward a future where our children can choose to stay in Flagstaff and where our workforce can find the housing they need to thrive. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to working with all of you to address these critical challenges.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Can I ask staff what the next step is? Is it asking for public comment or asking commissioners if they have any questions or comments? I never get it right. I'm so sorry.
It would typically be commissioners first.
And then public comment?
Second.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Right, I didn't want to mess it up. So, commissioners, do you guys have any, I guess I shouldn't have maybe let you sit down if he's going to say questions. Any questions for Michelle or comments? Anyone online, Adriana, or commissioners online, I should ask, have questions or comments?
Not seeing any last call.
So I have one.
Sure.
Sorry, I knew I was coming and with one if anyone else. So I appreciate you being here today, and I appreciate, of course, the focus that the real estate community has on housing affordability and availability. I'm wondering from your perspective or from the association's perspective, if you were in our seats, what would you focus on first, next, and why?
Starter homes. We need starter homes. Anything between 900 to 1,300 square feet. We need to get them built. We need to encourage developers. And I think most importantly, we need to streamline the process. It needs to not be so hard to bring in housing and develop our community. And that is a constant that we hear from builders, developers. The city just makes it too hard. So that's where I would really encourage starting and thinking about the cost. How can we keep the costs down at the city level when it comes to permitting? And my understanding with the developers is it's just so much time when they're going in to do their due diligence and how long it takes the city to approve. So if we could shorten that, then money would be saved on the developer standpoint, and then that wouldn't be passed along to the buyers.
Okay. So it sounds like process and then how do we get any costs associated with fees or process savings to the end user? Correct.
Here, there's a question from Councilmember House.
Lovely. Councilmember House, if you want to ask your question, it was a question, right?
It is.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if it's coming. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button here. So my question was, thank you again for the presentation. Kind of along the same lines as Chair McLaughlin, I was wondering what ideas or concepts the association is hoping to bring forward that we may not have been aware of yet.
To bring forward. We have so many ideas. Most of it is just making it more affordable, and we'd really like to see if we could pass along, like, for example, water meters just went up $3,000. Is there a way we can move that money to be not an upfront cost for the builder? Like, is there anywhere else that that cost can come from, or they need the $3,000? So cost savings is really important. We just want to help keep prices low. And any way we can do that, we are here to support you.
Councilmember House, did that answer your question, or do you have any other follow-up? I don't want to take it away from you. If you did.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other online folks? Any other in the room? Commissioner, question?
I
Yeah.
just have, I'm on the association as well. I'm a realtor in town, and I just think we want to be more involved. I think, we're just reaching out to you guys. We're out there all the time, boots on the ground. You can really rely on us. We have 600, 700 agents. They're not all within the board or on a commission, but I mean, we're trying to encourage more of that. But yeah, just really lean on us because we're there to help. So.
We really want to help. We are here for it. We have great people in the community. And so any messaging, anything we can do to work together.
Ms. Starr, you had your hand up.
I want to acknowledge the feeling of partnership we've had with meeting with the Realtors Association recently. We had the opportunity to meet with Michelle and with Jessica, talking about overlapping community education campaigns, talking about ways that we can do things differently. And I think we have ongoing meetings set up at this point in time, and if they're not set up, there's a lot of emails going back and forth setting them up. So I'm confident that we will receive with them set up, and staff feels the same way. We welcome the partnership, we welcome the information, and are excited to have the overlap that we do and the support in both directions.
Thank you. We're excited too.
And I didn't know if you wanted to share what you shared with me before the meeting, because I think that is a step, and if it's not ready for prime time, that's fine, but I think that is something small, but it's not.
We were exploring ways where we could get primary occupants in the homes. Like, what can we do? And I shared that I asked my clients when they're selling if they would be open to offering their home to a primary occupant for X amount of days. I was just at a listing appointment, and young couple in their 40s, they're up on their starter home. And they asked me, they're like, is there any way we can sell our house to a primary occupant? I said, absolutely. We can offer it for how long you want to. And it just kind of depends on the market, but they were so excited to hear that that was an option that they could do. Offer it to a local who's going to live in the house and not an investor. I think that's great.
I'm particularly excited that you call people in their 40s. You
I'm just gonna say that.
No. Nice young couple, and I'm like,
Like, kids are like 30 and 40 now. So you know, that's the younger they are, we're looking for the same homes. I think it's important.
Well, and
Recognize our middle age.
no, I'm young, I'm still young. But that was a follow-up question that I had. So I know that Realtors Association has access to really good, robust, and timely data.
We do.
So I'm wondering if there's a way y'all can work with staff on like an annual data report to the commission of what you guys have seen in the last year or the last, maybe it's every 6 months. I don't want to make it too cumbersome, but to give us a sense of like, not just what median prices are or these prices, but like how many days on market. What have you seen as far as the age of first time home buyers? Like you guys track so much really cool
Absolutely.
stuff.
We would be honored to share that information with you and super easy. We can just quickly do that.
Excellent. I mean, I don't know, I don't get to speak for everyone, so I don't know if that would be valuable to y'all, but yeah, I think it would be, I would love it, because I'm a team. So
Absolutely, we have it. Anyone else?
anyone else? Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Michelle. We appreciate your time and information. And it sounds like we will be in touch. We'll get to see you guys again. All right, item number 7B is the, public comment. I'll do it every time. Sorry. Okay, we're still on item 7A. Is there anyone who would like to have public comment here or online? Even said it out loud. I gave them a minute. Anyone online?
Anybody online?
Okay. Seeing no one here jumping up and down. Now I'm safe to move on to 7B. Okay, excellent. Thank you. 7B is a land availability, suitability study and code analysis project, code concepts report. This is a discussion item and I'm turning it over to Michelle and Tim and friends.
And friends.
Okay. But I wasn't
We
sure.
got a whole tribe to address this. I'm Michelle McNulty, I'm the planning director for the city. Tiffany Antol, the zoning code manager is with me, Debbie Peartree, with sustainability. And then Jennifer Michelson and Jessica Donahue are also part of this collaborative project, as well as our partners from Mountain Lawn. I just want to start by saying I'm really appreciative that we're on the same agenda as you, Michelle, and the words that you had to say. And I hope that you will find that a lot of what we're trying to tackle addresses some of what you said. Okay, you have the report. I think it's important to note, like, zoning code, the process is one part of it. There's, and you all know very intrinsically that there are a lot of variables that go into the cost of home ownership. There's interest rates, there's just the market value. And so we're trying to do what we can at the city level and at the local level. Next slide. Okay, I can go off the cuff, but. They now do the one.
Figure out the screen share. Back to
Kind of take it off.
Okay, that's fine.
You want me to share it?
You do.
Thanks, Tiffany.
No, thank you.
He's full of my dreams.
I'm gonna go off the cuff. I can talk while
Sorry.
They're DJing.
I'm like, nobody's on. It's gonna be fine. All right. I've got it handy to you want me to share. I got it. Okay, I got it.
like, this is a dramatic buildup. Every time we think we have this figured out, we don't.
Yeah, terrible.
Get it. All these youngsters in the room. Okay, so we're gonna start, before we talk about the code concepts, we kind of just remind everybody about the project overall and where we've been. So remember, we were here in April of 2024 and gave a presentation on the diagnostic report and the land suitability study. So the last cap is just that, it's the land availability suitability study, really taking a look at what lands we have left to develop with the eye from a residential potential. What are those barriers to developing those? And then what are the opportunities? And we wanted to do that one, so we could get an idea of how much land do we really have and do we have enough land for the amount of houses projected for the need. And then also we wanted to understand what our barriers are because there's a lot of best practices nationwide.
but they don't always apply to the context of the local community. And we wanted to make sure that any code recommendations and codes that come out of this project fit our community and actually get to the heart of where the challenges are. Through that, we also, so it was looking at development codes, environmental constraints. A lot of you are probably familiar that we have what's called the Resource Protection Overlay that regulates how we protect steep slope, floodplains, and tree resources. And so we were able to consider slope and floodplain when we were looking at the environmental constraints. The one thing that's less easy to really kind of map is that forest. So we kind of make some assumptions that when you look at what's available, that you could almost half that, and that might be too much of having that land because we have a requirement that you retain 50% of natural resources on your property. And we'll talk more about that as we go on, but I just wanted to explain what those environmental constraints were. And we also talk about the gaps in infrastructure. The code analysis project is intended to evaluate all development codes, so not just the zoning code. It was included to building code, fire engineering standards, our housing incentive policy, our traffic impact analysis manual. These are the things that we hear loud and clear from anyone trying to develop that are more of the barriers and kind of adding to that time that we just heard about. And then really through that lens of the housing and the climate emergency that council has declared, and making sure that the codes are aligned to move the needle of the goals and policies of both of those plans. So the code analysis project is broken into 3 parts, and that's because this is a really big project. And even when we break it down in 3 parts, we're going to bring you a lot of information, but we also want to make sure we're getting as much check-in as we can and getting that feedback. And so when we were here in April of 2024, we had the diagnostic report, and that was really the barriers report, kind of that flush of everything that we reviewed and identifying where the barriers are. It was kind of a snapshot in time, a really fact-based document. Now we're moving on to the code concepts, which have a lot more community conversation in them and are going to warrant a lot more discussion. So Jenny's going to hit on it again at the end, and we talk about next steps, but I just want to preface this that you're going to see a lot of us in some iteration of us because there's going to be a lot of interaction that we need to have with this group and a lot of other commissions and our members of our public. So the land availability, suitability, and the diagnostic report are complete. We're now at the code concepts, which is really looking at the highest priority barriers. And I want to be clear that right now we've limited this report more to the zoning code. And the reason for that is because sustainability has been working with the building department to incorporate the building code. And then we also have our engineering department is looking at some of the traffic stuff. So while this report isn't looking in at that as deeply, there are other groups looking at the other barriers that were identified in that diagnostic report. And this is just a list of all of the different materials that we reviewed, just so you can kind of see how much material was looked at. And, you know, we had a graphic in our last presentation that kind of talked about the vision and the, you know, policies have these big bold visions and mandates. And then we, of what we think our community is going to be. And we have these tools that we think are going to get us there. And then you have that picture of the reality. And it's not quite what we expected we were going to get. And we're trying to align all of our tools to be more aligned with that vision that we have for our community. And then, so this is just a snapshot of kind of what those high barriers were. So if anybody else has as bad advice as I will, I'm going to read this. So residential zones, our commercial zones, parking requirements, high occupancy housing, zoning map amendment process, subdivision procedures, street width and design, winter parking ordinance, resource protection overlay, the affordable housing incentives, sustainable building incentives, the street connectivity, transportation impact fees, and transportation demand management for traffic impact analysis. So these were the major key barriers that were really identified in the diagnostic report That report and the last is available online in their completed forms for anybody that wants to go to the community development webpage. It's under, I think it actually has its own link. You're looking at the screen, it's on the left, and you can get to those reports. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany.
Right, so while the diagnostic report was broad-based and included all of the development requirements, as Michelle mentioned, the code concepts report is primarily focused on the barriers found within the zoning and subdivision codes. So the report also includes a review of alternatives for reducing street widths and winter parking requirements, which are not directly related to the zoning. But they are overlapping with many of the issues that you find in the zoning code. So one of the ones we're going to talk about most is reduction of parking requirements. Wouldn't really want to talk about the reduction of parking requirements separate from like our street widths or our winter snow parking requirements. So that's why you're seeing those other code barriers added in, because they do have overlapping issues. And that is one of the fundamental things that you're going to find about the zoning code is it's not just one standard alone, it's how the standards overlap on top of one another. That makes certain points of the development process difficult, or why it makes the development hard to get across the line. It's everything in combination with one another. It's not one specific obstacle. So the report, the code concepts report is organized into two sections. The first section is a set of three scenarios. And those scenarios are focusing on some core standards and the incentives currently found in the zoning code. Those core standards are our land use regulations and housing types that are permitted by zoning district, our maximum density allowances, as well as what we allow in terms of floor area ratio. Believe me, I'll go through a lot more of these terminologies in detail as we get through this document or as we get through this presentation. Also, our maximum parking requirements, as well as our affordable and our sustainable building incentives. In addition, I mentioned two of the code concepts. There are two more that research was or we're looking at alternatives to, and that includes our resource protection overlay, as well as our sustainability requirements and incentives. There are a lot of things, as you all know, the Housing Commission, where the state steps in and intercedes and prohibits us from requiring certain things outright. So we've learned to incentivize things in lieu of requiring them. So it's just about how we go about adding certain requirements into our code. So with that, just in terms of the methodology, the code concepts report is really just looking all about alternatives. And it's helping us try to answer some big community questions that we have for all of you and definitely need your feedback and assistance with. And in terms of where do we go from here and what actual code recommendations do we get out of all of this? So the report methodology did modeling of prototypes for development. The prototype models were developed for each zone district or basically group of zones. So for example, all the commercial zones are grouped together. The prototype models test both the revenue impacts of potential code changes, such as allowing more units, and the cost impacts of code changes, in addition to options to reduce costs. The prototype models are applied to existing code requirements, as well as the three proposed scenarios that I'm going to get to later in this presentation. Additionally, there was a spatial analysis completed that was used to assess housing capacity for each one of those scenarios. So each scenario has a different set of outcomes, but we wanted to understand it through that spatial analysis of what could we actually do to housing production in our community based on different specific code changes. The spatial analysis was also applied because remember, the goal is two parts, right? Carbon neutrality is one goal, the housing issue is another goal. So looking at both of those issues, we also the spatial analysis also looked at how density and other code requirements could be applied to areas with low vehicle miles. Or VMT areas, so areas that we already know drive less. And we'll get to some of those results in a minute. Lastly, there was best practices research done on the specific items within the code, including resource protection and some sustainability incentives, as well as winter parking ordinance requirements. So let's get into the meat of it, the scenarios for the code standards and incentives. Scenario 1 is all about optimizing our existing incentives. So right now, the zoning code has an incentive program for the provision of affordable housing units. It also has incentives for sustainable design. So basically, this seeks to encourage a higher share of our development projects to use those incentives. It doesn't change much of the by right development standards. Scenario 2 is intended to elevate our sustainable design features by making them more of a requirement. And then offsetting with an increase in higher maximum densities and lower minimum parking requirements. Scenario 3 is really all about maximizing market rate housing production. It seeks to maximize the economic feasibility of all housing development to increase overall housing supply, which may slow housing cost increases over the long term. But, and there's less of a focus on the sustainability provisions. All three scenarios still include incentives. So scenario 2 and scenario 3 do include incentives, but scenario 2 and 3 also focus on increasing the by right allowances. Everybody understands what I mean by right versus incentive. By right is just you come in, you can have it. Here's the simplification of everything that was just in those previous scenarios in terms of outcomes, because each scenario is intended to really provide a different outcome. The first one being an increase in the overall housing production by reducing key barriers to development. So you can see that scenario 3 is that one that really is focused on housing production. That housing production is primarily focused on market rate, although the incentives can still be found. Sustainability becomes more of a medium priority in that particular situation. Next is elevating the sustainable design of all projects. You can see that scenario 2 does the best job in that regard. And then lastly, encouraging greater use of our incentives is found in scenario 1. So there's a lot of information in this table. I don't expect you to really absorb it all or memorize all of this, but essentially up at the top, it's telling you what our existing code allows. And this is, by the way, an oversimplification of our zoning code because in no way is it accurate and simple. But our existing code currently allows residential densities between 6 and 29 dwelling units an acre. Our parking spaces requirements are generally between 1 and 3 spaces per unit. It's a rough generalization. We offer a density bonus for our sustainability features that are up to 25%. We also can go up to 45% with a density bonus for the provision of affordable housing units. And that ranges anywhere from 5 to 45%, depending upon the category of affordability that's provided. There's also a parking reduction that is possible for affordable housing units currently. So scenario 1, to optimize the use of incentives, there would be no changes to the base code, and all of the changes would be directed towards those incentives. You would see a major increase in a density bonus and a major parking reduction. Scenario 2, what it would do is increase the base densities from 6 to 29 to 10 to 80 units an acre for base, for by right. It would also reduce base parking to between 1 and 1.5 parking spaces per unit, rather than the 1 to 3 you currently see. We are also looking at single-use residential buildings. We're looking at introducing floor area ratio caps in this particular scenario, as well as applying new sustainability requirements to all projects. In terms of the incentives, you would still see minor increases to the density bonus for incentive projects and parking reductions for those incentives. So the incentives would still exist, but we would also be raising the by right. So scenario 3 is almost exactly like scenario 2. It does remove the FAR. It does remove the sustainability requirements. So it's 100% pretty much focused on housing production. It still does include the ability to have incentives. So there's ways to still get density bonuses, although the base density allowed would be much higher. All 3 scenarios include really 2 changes that are sort of kind of up and coming in general. The first is what is required by House Bill 2721 actually, which is called missing middle, although it's specific to the housing types of townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, which need to be permitted in all zones that allow for single-family houses. And I would say this with some limitations. So right now, the way this bill is written is it's only those zones mile of our central business district. We currently don't have a central business district. So we would have to define one in order to go out a mile. Just grabbing our downtown zoning district called central business, which is really that core of the downtown, a mile out grabs south side. It grabs Plaza Vieja. It goes all the way up to why am I not there to not Columbus, what's the name of the neighborhood? Why am I forgetting? Coconino Estates. Cherry Hill, it's actually a fairly dramatic area, but that would be the primary area that would be focused. Within that area, it's the R1N zone that gets most impacted, as well as the community commercial zone, because our community commercial zone does allow for single family residential. So all 3 scenarios, except that the missing middles to some degree is going to be permitted in those zoning categories that allow for single family homes. This report, though, is making the assumption that we're going to allow it citywide. And is recommending that we pursue it citywide, because to do it on a limited basis that's in the statute will be very difficult and cumbersome. There are other provisions that we also have to apply it to 10% of all currently undeveloped area. So just with the rules and structures of how zoning law works and uniformity provisions, it's really, really difficult to implement this spotty zoning technique that this particular bill wants. And so applying it citywide, and we'll be back here in about a month to talk about this with the Housing Commission and see how they specifically want to see this bill implemented. Lastly, then the other scenario that is taken into account is the use of single-use residential buildings in commercial zones. So right now, the easiest way to do housing in commercial zones is through a mixed-use project. So when you do a mixed-use project, which means both commercial and residential, those projects are permitted by right. When you do single-use residential, which is all residential in a commercial zone, you need to have a conditional use permit. What this is proposing is to get rid of the conditional use permit. In scenario 1, that would be as an incentive for affordable or sustainable projects. But in scenario 2 and 3, that would remove the conditional use permit for by right projects. Next up, talking about densities, I already sort of broke I spilled the beans and told you that we were looking at densities anywhere between 10 and 80. When you look at this table, some of these density standards are higher. So as you look at this table, what it's telling you is B is by right, S is with a sustainability incentive, A is with the affordable housing incentive, and how that would, of course, build on one another. Scenario 1 envisions that the city would maintain its current maximum densities for by right development. Scenario 2 and 3 would have by right elevated significantly. What is interesting about this density that's being proposed here is that in most cases under the current code, the increase in the maximum densities that are included in all three concepts would trigger what is called high occupancy housing. And it would trigger those specific regulations. This analysis does assume that the HOH regulations are adjusted. It was listed as a barrier. There aren't specific code provisions, but the assumption is that those regulations wouldn't currently impact these particular development projects. So you just need to take that into account. Or that they're going to be replaced by some other alternative standards. And if anybody has questions about what high occupancy housing does or the why behind it, happy to fill you in at a later date because I can talk for 8 hours on it. All right, the density bonuses by scenario, you'll see scenario 1 bumps them up really high. You're looking at almost doubling what current incentives really allow. Scenario 2 and 3 have a much more modest approach to the incentives, because again, the by right is being elevated. Floor area ratio, the reason, and I'll just sort of say this about high occupancy housing. One of the reasons why we have high occupancy housing regulations was when this particular code was adopted in 2011, it included provisions that allowed big density in commercial zones as part of mixed use as part of a mixed use project, of which you saw immediately Village at Aspen Place, the Hub, Fremont Station, the Standard, and I can go on. There was a fairly significant community backlash against those developments. And part of the reason that we were seeing the backlash was it was concerned about density, but a big part of it was also about the intensity, right? So those are two different aspects that a zoning code brings. Density is those number of units per acre. Intensity is how many people are actually living in those units and how big those units are. So it's easy to see a 20 unit apartment building that's all 1 bedrooms does not have the same intensity that a 20 unit apartment building has that's all 5 bedrooms, right? You can have a lot more people living in a 5 bedroom unit than you can in a 1. So a large part of what HOH or those high occupancy housing standards were intending to do was to address intensity in addition to density. The idea of floor area ratios, and I've thrown this up here as the definition. In most residential zones today, what you see is lot coverage. So you're on a residential lot, you have a percentage of the lot that you can cover with development, with your structure. So right now in R1, for example, it's 35% of the lot. What this does, what floor area ratio does, is it is taking into account all stories of a building. So it's not just the base ground floor of a building, it's all of the stories. And it's right now, this is something that is only applied to commercial and industrial development. We do not apply this particular standard to residential. I have actually been sassing this part of the code. House Bill 2721 for missing middle actually includes us adding floor area ratio. The reason why it wants to go to floor area ratio is to help offset that intensity factor that we experience as part of the development, because density is not the true base controller. So what this is coming up with is just in scenario 2, adding in floor area ratios for all of the zoning characteristics. So a lot of times when I go to the Planning and Zoning Commission with a particular text amendment and I'm struggling getting it across, I'm like, hey, this could increase housing production. And they're like, well, how does this guarantee that we're gonna get smaller homes? Right? Because what we end up a lot of times is we'll create smaller lots. We get just as big of a home, if not bigger, on the smaller lots than we had anticipated. We tried to incentivize smaller homes, we're not getting there. One of the things that we could do is we could throw in a requirement to get the smaller homes as part of an offset for increasing density. We could set a floor area ratio that then would also help to size what these homes look like. Now, subdivisions today, if you do a 6,000 square foot lot, which is pretty standard in a single family home development, 0.5 would mean 3,000 square feet. That's still a fairly significant home, right? That actually is pretty big. But as you look towards missing middle, right? If on a 6,000 square foot, you now have a triplex or a duplex or a fourplex, that standard could keep that duplex triplex from becoming 9, 12 bedroom duplexes, triplexes, which is what we were seeing abundantly built in the South Side neighborhood, to something that goes into regular neighborhoods and looks more like the duplexes and triplexes they built in the 60s, 70s in Wisconsin or Upper Greenlaw, for example. Upper Greenlaw is a great mix of single family homes and duplexes that look just like single family homes. So again, it's about coming in and trying to set the standard and getting what we want, getting what we want, the density, but also getting the units that we're looking for. Because my assumption when you all say starter homes is that you mean smaller homes. Which has been something that has been harder for us to attain.
I have a question about intensity. It's okay if I interrupt.
Yeah.
So is it true though that we are prohibited from regulating intensity in the majority of residential neighborhoods already? Because like if you have a single family home, there's nothing to say you can't rent out every bedroom to a different person. Like I'm pretty sure that commonly happens in a lot of residential neighborhoods where students primarily can't find apartments, so they group up together and they all rent out a bedroom together in a house. A single family style of home.
Sure, and our definition of family is fairly high. So in a lot of cities where students are a predominant factor, how they generally tend to control that is through the definition of family. Our definition of family is 8. It's up to 8 unrelated individuals, which is why we were seeing homes that are 8 bedroom, 8 bathroom, which is just outside of the norm for what you would see of a traditional single family dwelling.
Yeah, and to be clear, I actually don't agree with that cities should be trying to regulate, familial connections between who lives in a home. But I just wanted to note that like we can't regulate intensity on single family housing at the moment.
But there's different ways. I think what we're trying to say is that there's different ways to address that intensity. And that intensity is if the goal is to achieve a smaller starter home, something that somebody could purchase, that there are some zoning code ways to address getting smaller units.
Well, that also makes me a little nervous because one thing I actually wanted to bring up through this project was the possibility of something like SROs, which used to be quite common and were like a super cheap version of housing available in most cities, but now we sort of made those illegal. But if we're moving in a direction of regulating intensity, obviously that means we can't build SROs. So we don't have to go into that.
This is just one option of a scenario. The idea why this is also only found in scenario 2 is because the idea is that smaller dwelling units would also offset carbon footprint. So there is a multiple layer here where scenario 2 is overlapping the sustainability as well as the housing related issues. And again, it doesn't mean that we have to go in any of these routes. We could absolutely increase density and continue to see the larger homes being built. It's just one of those things to understand. The Planning and Zoning Commission does frequently ask us, how can you guarantee affordable new home units? We're not saying these units come in at any cheaper rate. And so if we're willing to acquiesce on other standards that are important in our community, how are we going to be assured that the community is getting what it desires?
Yeah,
So those, find something I think I heard Tanner say. We can both regulate or change the definition of family, and we may need to for other reasons than just this issue right here, and still allow for single room occupancy housing. Those two are not, like, they can exist together. So even if one thing happens, doesn't mean the other can't occur. Yeah.
I just wanted to add real quick that as Tiffany goes through these scenarios, not like we would necessarily adopt one wholesale or adopt another wholesale. There can be elements from different scenarios that we can adopt together. So really, these aren't set in stone. They're just looking at lots of different options that the city could take.
Yeah.
So just encourage everyone to be thinking about that, like what elements of the scenarios speak to you and the issues that you feel need to be addressed. And so, and kind of thinking more holistically across all three scenarios to what elements you think would be effective.
and I'll add just one last thing and then I'll stop derailing us because this is just a technical question. But as I understand it, the conversation about intensity isn't actually about housing affordability. It's about like neighborhood character and or other residents going to not like that intensity. Because like if I had a triplex building and I stuck 6 beds in it and rented it out to 6 people, like I would not be able to rent those beds out for very much. They would technically be quite affordable because each person would have less space. Like in my home, if I'm renting out an individual bedroom, I can't rent that out for as much as if I rented out the entire house. But so I think the intensity conversation is more about like neighborhood character and what people expect. But
I
I'll
think
leave it
the
at that.
conversation is that the city received feedback when we had developments come in that were of a higher intensification than people had anticipated. And it is not only a character issue, but a big function of that was traffic. That they are, because they can have a higher level of population living within them, that they have additional parking issues. So parking is a big part of the conversation as well as traffic. That's what we received as part of and where we went to on high occupancy housing. But you can review the high occupancy housing plan and it includes all of those issues that came up during that planning process. The parking
I was
standards.
just gonna say really quick too.
Yeah.
I know a lot of the feedback that I heard outside of the Aspen project was because of the student housing. So we were focusing on NAU's problem, not our community's problem. I mean, some of it was related because they were taking up some of our housing, but I think a lot of it had to do because of the student housing too, not just the traffic, not the big combination.
And unfortunately for us, there isn't a differential between housing and student housing. So we don't have that differential in zoning code because we don't build structures for the actual human. I mean, we don't differentiate between the people that are living in residential units. We're just building residential units. So it's a part of the conversation that's the one I think zoning can't influence or impact.
Add on if I can real quick to what Genevieve said. We've had some feedback with people looking at the scenarios who are like, well, I don't like this when they're thinking wholesale. Our goal is to balance priorities within the organization, both sustainability and housing. We've been working really hard towards the word and, not the word or, which I think is what you see in the scenario. Some of them look like that might be an or, but that's not where our goals are. The scenarios would give us a place to start for conversation. And for us to be able to say what we like or don't about each one. I also don't see anything coming forward where like it's all scenario X, that it's going to be a mix and match. And the thoughtful conversation we're having today has really been helpful for that. So thank you.
So next up is the parking standards by scenario. It does look at decreasing the parking ratios For by right project, again, scenario 2, 3, similar to what you're seeing in the density. And then focusing in scenario 1 on those reductions being within the incentive area rather than by right. And I'm gonna skip it on.
All right, so I'll present on a few slides about what the consultants looked at in terms of sustainability features. So as we mentioned, scenario 1, or we have existing code scenario 1, 2, and 3. So basically in the existing code and scenarios 1 and 3, it looks at a lot of these features as incentives versus scenario 2, it looked at them as incentives as well as the base code, so sustainability incentives and affordable housing incentives. So some of the features they looked at were having construction meet an energy efficiency standard, building an all electric building, on-site solar, water resource protection, so water reduction conservation measures inside the home, using sustainable materials, managing materials during construction as well as deconstruction of any tear down buildings, looking at EV charging, and then secure bike parking and transit process. So obviously some of those apply to multifamily, some can apply to both single family and multifamily, but looking at those features across the 3 scenarios as well as existing code. They also modeled carbon emissions from different development types and looking at how those sustainability features play out in those scenarios in the graph, the table that I showed in the last slide. So the consultant looked at different sources of carbon emissions as well as different sources that sequester carbon, basically remove it or avoid emitting it. And so this is kind of like use all these things. It's in quite a bit of detail in the report. I can go into it in more detail, but I will just do a high level in this presentation. But basically, this is what they looked at when they were modeling carbon emissions. And basically what they found, and this isn't very surprising, is that scenario 2, which had the increase in the sustainability features in by right development, but also had additional sustainability incentives and affordable housing incentives, had the lowest greenhouse gas emissions over a 30-year time period per unit. But when we're looking at this, we can also see that in existing code as well as scenarios 1 and 3, when taking sustainable sustainability incentives, that also reduce the carbon emissions per unit compared to developments that were developed by right without using those sustainable design features, as well as ones that use the housing incentives and didn't use those design features as well. So not super surprising, but just that we can look at the impacts of different ways of developing and how that impacts carbon emissions from each per unit over 30 years period. That's my last slide. Yeah, okay, here you go.
Okay, and then the spatial analysis that we talked about up in the methodology, it went through and did sort of the total capacity for new units based on the code scenarios. So you can see that scenario 3, which is highly focused on just housing production as a whole, would result in the highest net units, with scenario 2 coming in at a close second. Also, in addition, the spatial analysis tried to determine areas that already had low vehicle miles. No surprise, downtown comes in as low VMT. There wasn't, what we couldn't find was just one specific zoning district that would be easy to target. To say, oh, the community commercial zone ended up in low vehicle miles traveled areas, and so we can just increase density in that zone and then align it with our carbon neutrality goals. The suggestion in this case, if we do want to go with focusing where we put density, the suggestion would be adding new zoning overlays or doing proximity-based zoning to say like transit corridors, doing something more along the lines of transit-oriented design. But there was no clear one zoning category that came up as a winner. So the key findings from the scenarios. The biggest finding, just no shocker and surprise, is that the existing development environment is extremely challenging with the high cost of construction and land. So there's a huge function of the cost of housing that is not controlled at all by any development codes. So labor, material, cost of land fall outside of what anything the code could do. If you go in and you spend any time looking at the prototype models, you will think, why would anybody develop here? Because it's not possible to actually break even. What it's important to understand about those prototype models is they are just a snapshot in time. They're based on best available data. The idea with those prototype models is if we pushed and pulled on the code, could we move the levers either way towards making housing more economically feasible while including sustainability functions or provisions. And so there is possibilities within those models, it shows. So scenario 1 presents a viable opportunity for increasing the attractiveness of our incentive programs. It's the higher risk strategy, however, for increasing housing production. So when modeling what overall housing production would look like, that is on the lower end. So it gets us towards meeting our goals, but it doesn't get us as far towards meeting our goals. It does have it is also the lowest risk option when dealing with Proposition 207. And I don't know how familiar you are with Prop 207, but essentially if we change a code provision that adds cost or can impact the value of a property. So say we took a building height from 60 feet to 45 feet, we could be on the hook for compensating that property owner for the change in the value of their property. Or we can provide them with a waiver of the code to begin with. So we always have to take into account that wherever we go within the zoning code, what's the likelihood of getting those Prop 207 claims? Scenario 2 illustrates that there's a viable opportunity to elevate sustainability standards for all new developments, so long as those increased costs are offset by the economic benefits of increased density and reduced parking. Scenario 3 achieved similar results to scenario 2 in improving housing outcomes, but did not elevate sustainability outcomes relative to scenario 2. Across all of the scenarios, parking reductions were critical to the market feasibility of higher density prototypes. If the city desires to concentrate density in areas where households are likely to drive less, then we would need to use targeted rezoning, new overlays, or proximity-based regulation, rather than trying to adjust our base zones. If the policy goal is to broadly increase density throughout the community, then scenarios 2 and 3 are a more effective approach for achieving this end. The increase in housing capacity under scenario 1 is highly dependent upon the increased uptake of density bonuses under the incentive program. So we are looking to get some feedback on this particular set of scenarios. We're trying to ascertain if there are certain zone districts where you think it would be appropriate or make sense to apply one scenario versus another. For example, do we want to allow much higher residential density in commercial areas? Do we want to focus higher density in our core residential zones, the R1? Where do we want to push and pull within the different zoning districts? Also, which scenario are you finding most appealing? And again, the different elements of each scenario and those core standards can be traded off in amongst one another. For example, scenario 1 would incentivize single-use residential. Well, you could still go with scenario 2 and still incentivize single-use residential for affordable housing in the commercial space. So that's one way in which you can still achieve multiple goals. You can still do more for incentivizing certain land use types with the incentives and still go with scenario 2 or 3, which will also increase housing production. Do you support moving forward with the substantial parking reductions that are modeled? I have a feeling that this is going to be probably one of the big conversation topics. And the reason why we'll jump into is because we have winter parking ordinance requirements. You can't park overnight on the street for 5 months of the year. We probably, as a community, are more restrictive than most communities with similar snow. And so do we need to look at managing that different? Do we want to let the market figure it out? What do we do? We know that when projects have come in that have reduced parking, because we do have zoning provisions now that have reduced parking pretty significantly on residential projects. But there has been conflicts in terms of those neighborhoods and what they see in terms of on-street parking and how that is managed. I mean, and as just a person who picks up the phone and answers it, I frequently get complaints from folks. Can you do something to prohibit the people parking in front of my house? Just happens quite frequently.
Which we can do that. Parking districts. Well, sorry, we'll get into it later.
Okay.
But to be clear, we can do that. There are tools.
Sure, and there are also public streets where people can park currently on public streets in the vast majority. And there are only some areas that probably need parking districts, which are in higher density areas where in some of the outlying neighborhoods, it's probably less of an issue. So the next step is if we want to pursue code and map concepts that would more narrowly target upzonings to areas with low VMT. So do we want to take those density upticks and do we want to focus them around our transit corridors? So that's one of the possibilities is we could allow much higher densities in and around where we have permanent transit lines, which could also offset some of the issues and concerns in regards to parking. So that's one of the ways that we could move forward with additional provisions. So next up, there are some other code concepts that are talked about within this particular report and give us some general direction on where to go with these particular features. Due to limitations in state law, like we talked about earlier, there are certain sustainability features that we currently can't just require. So we can't require a building to be all electric. And in light of that, the only way to encourage or move towards that direction is to incentivize those features. So the code concepts document looked at communities that basically came up with like a menu-based choice. So you list all of the potential sustainability features that could be added into a development project. Each is given a certain set of points. And the particular developer, contractor, builder can go through and pick and choose based on what works best for their project. Because again, what's going to work well in a single family home may not work the best in a multifamily situation. So part of that proposal is coming up with that menu-based approach. The code concepts documents is also recommending that TDM, transportation demand management, become a critical component of that menu. So looking at how we can reduce the emissions from transportation, including things like transit-oriented development, carpooling or ride sharing, bike facilities, transit tax programs, and other site design that encourages transportation. So ways within a development to get people to encourage. And we've done this over time with different developments. We do have developments that come in and they'll offer transit passes to all of their tenants and the like in terms of trying to offset what parking they might have reduced on site. The next one is for resource protection overlay. Michelle briefly covered what our resource protection overlay does, but I think the important thing to get across is that our resource protection overlay standards are the highest for residential development. So in terms of preservation rates, all of the required preservation rates are higher in the residential zones than they are in the commercial and industrial zones. When this provision was adopted in 1990, commercial and industrial development was our priority. Residential development today is our priority, but they are still in the position of having to preserve the highest level of resources. For example, forest resources. If you're in a commercial development, you're looking at or if you're in a commercial zone, you're looking at preserving 30%. So if you do a residential project in a commercial zone, you have to preserve 30% of the tree resources. But if you're a residential project in a residential zone, you have to preserve 50% of tree resources. So there are some disparities. When you look at resource protection, in addition to the type of development, it's the hardest development I think to work with overall is residential, single-family detached housing, because you're creating roads, all of the infrastructure to serve those lots. The levels of resources are probably the most difficult to deal with in those situations. In those situations, you end up saving 30 to 40% of the overall site area of a subdivision for resources. So that's 30 to 40% of the gross land area that's just set aside for trees and slopes and floodplains. With all of that being said, resource protection, it keeps our community character. It is a community character function. It's part of the aesthetics. It is part of what attracts people to our community. It is part of what people recognize and appreciate about Flagstaff. In a lot of ways, too, people closely tie resource protection to open space requirements, even though they're totally separate, and we have completely separate open space requirements. So there was an in-depth analysis done of other locations, of what they do in terms of resource protection. What this particular code concepts is proposing is sort of downsizing the existing overlay. So the existing overlay was developed in 1990. It was essentially applied to every piece of vacant land that was over 5 acres at the time. There was not an assessment done to determine what the value of the resources were within any of that land. The way that these resource protection overlays are occurring in other communities is they go in and they do detailed analysis of where are the important resources, where are the features that we should be preserving that are high level value resources, and then applying those standards that way. So the recommendation here is that we move backwards towards that type of resource protection overlay. It does also have some short-term provisions of maybe making some tweaks here and there in the interim into our resource preservation, because if we do go the larger route, it will take a longer period of time in order to complete that work. So there are some both long-term and short-term ways to go about looking at resource protection overlay. Additionally, reduce street widths and winter parking ordinance. So over time, our street width standards have only increased in width. Currently, we have for residential, single-family residential development, a local residential street, that right of way is going to be 56 feet wide. So it has grown over time. That includes your travel lanes, your on-street parking, your curb gutter, your parkway, your sidewalk, and the bench on the back of the sidewalk. So over time, we've increased the width of streets. The most recent increase was 2 feet. That was completed after the adoption of our most recent fire code. So it is our fire code that is setting our street width standards. But when you take street widths on top of layering lot requirements, on layering everything else, what you'll find is even if we set a minimum density of 6 units an acre for single family residential, the highest you're probably going to get to is about 4.2 units an acre. So just physically in terms of space with everything that's got to be provided. So the code concepts report does look at how some street variations might get us to slightly higher density for some development types, and that really is going to be the detached single family. Again, this is a significant issue with our fire department and our fire protection resources, and so anything that's done in terms of street widths would need to be done in conjunction with our fire department. In terms of the winter parking ordinance, like we talked about, 5 months out of the year, you can't park overnight on the street. And so there are alternative code concepts that look at parking on designating specific streets for snow removal based on their traffic volumes, or emergency services such as focusing on arterials and collector roads as the primary. And there are some places where they don't plow residential streets. There's also implementing forms of odd even parking limitations, also looking at only prohibiting on-street parking during the declared snow accumulation. Of course, you can guess that the staff feedback we got was enforcement, not possible. So, thank you, nice way of putting it. Thanks for playing, but, no, thank you. I mean, ultimately what it comes down to is whatever direction we go to, we have to look at offsetting additional resources, additional mandates. We might need to manage community expectations differently. There's never a snow season where somebody picks up the phone and says, you nailed it. Right. You nailed it. I mean, have you done it? I haven't done it. So, there definitely is that consideration, but one of the ways to sort of alleviate and the ways that we could reduce parking, or I think make more people in the community comfortable with reducing parking on residential developments, would be to make it more flexible or possible to use our streets for parking, because we do require our streets to provide that additional 12 feet of right of way just for parking. So if we're not going to use it for the right of way, if we're not able to use that parking, then maybe we go back towards the street width conversation. So again, trade-offs here and there to look at. So the concepts, decision points, we could, would you support sort of that points-based approach for sustainability requirements? Should we include a wider menu of strategies? I'm sure every single one of you is gonna be like, yes, I want bus passes. No, I'm just kidding. Resource protection overlay, should we look at the longer term solution of narrowing down the existing overlay? Should we dive into short-term changes that could alleviate or make it easier for some of the residential developments to get going and moving along? In terms of street widths, do we support a strategy outlining the process for creating narrow local street designs, even if that meant that our fire department needed additional resources or staffing? Are there trade-offs we're willing to make? Same thing with winter parking ordinance. Because again, it's also about managing the community expectations and what folks are looking for. Because that is our role, is to serve all of the residents of Flagstaff in terms of what their needs are, and everybody comes at it from a different place and context of what they need for these resources. And lastly, next steps. So I get to talk about this, it's to stop talking very soon. Public outreach. So the first bit of public outreach, like we talked about, there's 3 different steps in this process. The first part of the public outreach was very targeted. We reached out to those who are actively using our codes and requirements to figure out what the barriers were. We could have done that broader outreach, but I don't know that everybody has that intimacy with the level of plans or the level of frustration with plans that a lot of our local developers deal with on a regular basis. So that level of public outreach was really targeted in the beginning to help us just identify those 4 barriers. And then from there, we are now in this code concepts of where are we willing to go and to make housing more affordable. It is possible. We can make housing construction cheaper by reducing some of these standards. But what trade-offs are we willing to accept as a community in order to do that? And then we need to also, we're basically at that point of resolving these outstanding decision points so that we can then get back with the consultants and get the code recommendations. Because I don't think any of us feel like we're at an easy, comfortable place to say, yes, please go and reduce the street width standards so that we can stand up in front of council, but not really have the backing of our partners or of all of the community in terms of what is necessary in order to get those codes adopted. So we want to get to those formal code recommendations. I think the other thing is really to understand about all of these documents is while they move from draft to final versions, they are just that, they're studies. They provide recommendations. They don't actually do anything until we're standing in front of council getting the code amended. So it's really that code amendment process, and we might irritate some along the way. I mean, we definitely irritated our internal staff when we started to list barriers. Because when you list those barriers, I mean, I don't like saying it, but sidewalks technically have cost development. But we all value sidewalks. They're very important. They provide a very important feature. None of us want to forego sidewalks in order to necessarily make housing more affordable. So but when you have to point those things out, that all of those things do add cost to housing, it's hard for us all to recognize and appreciate. But again, it comes with trade-offs and balance. So there are certain aspects of our community we want, we appreciate, we expect new development to provide, but where are we willing to sort of trim it down? And with that,
I just want to add on the public outreach. We do actually have Renee, a local public outreach expert on our team, and she's going to help kind of formulate some of this information. We know it's a lot. It's a lot for experts, let alone people who do not deal with this stuff at all. So we are trying to make it digestible and ways that we can communicate, especially to our neighborhoods that are highest risk for displacement. Like, we really want them to understand what we're doing, and in some ways that we're trying to also help make housing easier in other neighborhoods, so it's not so focused on them. There's a story to tell. We're still trying to figure out how to tell that story. And then we're also looking for additional funding within our budget to even hold more robust, like a town hall style meeting. We recognize that this is a lot, and we need a lot of input on it in order to make that last step that Tiffany has about the adoption of code amendments. Ideally, we're going to come out, we'd rather spend the time to kind of go long to go quick, and getting all the information and kind of work through some of these conversations that quite frankly, I think this community is long overdue to have. And then be able to rapid fire, sorry, and not a good manager, but kind of like rapid fire, come and make the changes. It would be good timing if we can have our regional plan update voted in by the voters, and have these changes and implementing everything at one time. And we really do want to move quickly, but we also want to do it right. We don't want to break things along the way as we make changes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, all you guys, for your presentation. I will open it up to commissioners with questions or comments.
I have a meta question. So I have a lot of feedback, but I don't want this to be just me talking hours. And some of the feedback is directly to your question. But then a lot of it is actually more about the overall direction of the project, and it's a little bit more meta. So should I just give like the feedback in direct response to your question first, let other people talk, and then circle back to the more project direction feedback?
I guess I do have
much for your commission.
Yeah, I guess I do have a question for staff. So we're 30 minutes until the end of our meeting. It feels like a compact timeline to have a robust and thoughtful discussion about I'm guessing that the goal is to provide feedback. Yes, or is it just to take in stuff and think about it?
It's a balance, from my understanding is to receive feedback, but they're coming back.
So we're gonna go to our schedule right now is that we're gonna present this thing. We have sustainability tonight. And then council on February 4th, and then the Transportation Commission collecting that feedback. I would offer to you, because that was a lot we just threw at you. Some of you are really prepared and might have your thoughts, others might need a couple days. So I guess what I would offer is, yes, we can come back. We can come back next month and have that part 2 of this. But if there's really some important things that you want us to know before we do this presentation in front of council, then if you could send any of those specific comments or questions to, I'm going to assume it's going to be Adriana. I'm going to get the same thing, just don't copy everybody, because I think we get into open meeting act laws, but get that information to her. That way we can see it and kind of, as we present to council, kind of get an overview of what we heard from the Housing Commission. But then we're happy to come back. I mean, we recognize that we just, still a lot of words over an hour and not a lot of information, so.
So the things at the end of the agenda, we can bypass the staff updates, that type of thing. This discussion is more important. But my understanding is it's a gut feel reaction now. What are the big picture thoughts?
Are we putting this to mark? I mean, are we just?
Right. And then the more detailed ones coming, because we're not at the end of the process. We're in the middle of the feedback process. We're also going to be having other opportunities on a public scale, not just simply to commissions for additional detailed feedback. So what we're not doing is telling you, you got 30 minutes, this is it, get it out and we're done. That's not really. It's, sometimes Tiffany does that, but usually only the staff. She's like, read it and tell right now. And so we know it's a lot, but it's important that you hear all of it, just like the other commissions are going to hear all of it, so that you have the opportunity to know the overall concepts. And I do have to say, when I first saw these, my vision and I were talking about this outside for a second, is that I really didn't understand that it's a mix, that we can mix, we can match, we can say we like, we don't like this piece with that piece. And so it's that feedback. Did you hear something today that made you go, did you hear something that made you go, yes? Like, what is it that stuck with you? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, one of the big core components of all of this is reducing parking maximums. And so, you know, is that something that's immediately alarming? Sometimes to some, it depends on where we are in the process of the feedback that we get. But I mean, if there's anything out there of where the direction that it's going, or even those density numbers, you know, is that frightening? Because when we did let the door open, it kind of came back at us. So now I think we locked down the door and now we're trying to open it back up again. And are we opening it up in the appropriate way?
Okay.
Chair Commissioner Milazzo has a question. His mic isn't working, so I'm happy to read it out loud.
We did kind of co-op Tyler, so I just want to own that to go back to you, maybe with the larger question.
Sorry, Moses talk, then I'll come back, I'll give my feedback in response to your direct questions, and then I'll let other people talk, and then I'll circle back to my more direction of the project questions.
All right, so what's Moses' question?
What guarantees can the city legally demand from developers that they will pass any savings on to home buyers? The problem I have with all these ideas of decreasing costs to development is that there's no way to enforce cost savings being passed to buyers. We've seen it doesn't happen when some costs have decreased in the past.
It's only really through the incentives and when we get commitment through the affordable housing process that we can pass along costs. I know overall in terms of the affordable housing incentives, we've been more successful with rental than we have with ownership. Ownership and the incentives is hard. You know, we're still looking for the perfect answer. I think the perfect answer is the state of Maryland has to require it.
No, we live in Arizona, it's not happening.
But there you go. I mean, that is part of the issue is that we don't have a lot of ability in that regard. But I would also say that, you know, in my tenure with the city, in terms of watching new single-family homes come up for sale, I've watched a developer sell a home in the $300,000 range, and within a year later, that house being resold for $1 million, and it's not the developer who got that benefit.
It's also worth mentioning that certain types of housing are cheaper than the alternatives. Like if I have 1,000 square foot single family home, all the marketing in the world is not going to allow me to sell it for the same price that a 2,000 square foot home on that same lot would have gone for. I mean, we've got realtors here, is that not the case?
Well, that's true. And the other thing I think you have to consider is when a developer sets his initial prices, and then he actually finishes that home, the cost of all of his supplies change drastically sometimes. And so they can't control that, so they have to increase their price to offset that cost. But it's also based on the appraised value and market conditions that have happened during that construction development time period too. Like if the market's tanked during that time, even if their costs have remained steady, they can't increase the price. If the market's gone up, it can go either way, and their costs have been stable, then they can capture windfall. So I think Moses's question about like that end user benefit is more controlled by the market, and then the costs are the costs. And when they're out of balance, we don't get development. And when they're
not in balance, then we get development, but it's expensive. And so, yeah. I think there's both. Yeah.
Yeah, can I, on that, kind of in that vein of that question, I actually have a question for you all. So like, you raise a good point, Tyler, about the smaller footprint, the smaller price tag. But I'm curious if there's any data that would show that those homes tend to be more desirable to the second home community because it's like, well, I'm only gonna be there for the weekend. I just want to go to the key 1,000 square foot. It's not a lot to clean. I mean, do we know, I just curious, I mean, it's more of a balance of, yeah, we put more of those on the market, but do those become more desirable to the second home market, or what does anybody know that?
I would think they're also more desirable to people who just have less money to spend on housing. Yeah, probably really difficult to get at that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I was just curious, like, the data, yeah, it's just a question.
Is there a follow-up for Moses? Is that?
There was.
Okay.
He said, so the decreases in costs can be used as a way of improving accessibility to housing. Destroying walkability by not requiring sidewalks, for example, will not improve costs and will make the city a worse place to live. And then to that extent, Council Liaison House has a point to make, and for the record, I just wanted to make sure that she has an opportunity to say it out loud. Council Liaison House, would you like to?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I was just asking, sort of to Moses's same point. I was asking if there was a way to tie incentives or cost savings to the developer's planned cost points. For example, if the house would be, or if homes would be priced to meet missing middle needs, there would be incentives that were tied to ensuring the homes stay in that price point.
I can take that one if Chair, if you're comfortable with that. The concept between the two. This is something we as staff struggle with overall. Incentives are only that, they're voluntary incentives. And when someone is accessing them, it means that our community has agreed to trade something, whether it be in the regulatory arena with decreased parking or decreased landscaping, whatever it is, or in the financial arena where fees are reimbursed, et cetera. Our community has traded something in exchange for an affordability commitment. And in that situation, that's totally different, where we can codify that in a development agreement or a two-party agreement with specifications that both parties can be held legally accountable to. When we're talking about decreases in costs that are general decreases in costs, it comes back down to that trickle-down economics theory of like, we decrease the cost and ultimately that price is going to be cheaper. I'll let the experts speak to that. I'll tell you from a city staff perspective, when we've had that conversation with multiple developers and they say, we are going to be building homes at this price point. And we say, okay, so big development is going to be 10 years before you're actually building homes. You're telling me that because you're making a commitment to build, let's just call it workforce housing, you're making a commitment to build workforce housing, that you're going to sell at the price point you're discussing with us today, regardless of what the appraisals are or what the market does. Well, and their answer is, no, we're not. And fairly, like I get it. That's, you know, we live in a capitalistic society. They have investors to satisfy, et cetera. And so it's that piece of okay, so how do we, at what point does that trickle down? Is there a way to help it trickle down, that type of thing? And that is a piece we have not solved. We're not aware of another jurisdictions that solved. Other thought processes surrounding creation of housing is that if a bunch is open and builders are building on spec and there's competition and it's going to drive prices down. There's been some speculation with opening up JWP that might happen. I think those of us that have lived in this community for a long time can talk about that's not typically the trends we've seen in our community. One, it's a workforce issue. I mean, you can usually tell who has the plumbers this week and the framers last week. Like it's a workforce piece. It's also they don't have to build on spec. They can build at the demand piece, and they're able to command the prices that the appraisals come back at. And so it's that balancing act of like, how do we, and we're open to thoughts and ideas, and if somebody has a magic solution in their pocket, whip it out, because we're ready. But that's the piece that we struggle with. Incentives, voluntary, totally different than reduce overall cost, hoping that it brings pricing down.
It's worth noting that there are some current examples of cities successfully bringing down housing costs significantly through supply. Austin, Texas is the one that's getting one mark right now. We've experienced 7% declines in year-over-year housing costs and rents since COVID. So their housing costs inflated in COVID like everywhere else, but since then they've brought a ton of supply online. They've actually brought costs down very steeply. I can't say that I fully endorse the Austin approach because a lot of that housing supply was done through highway widenings and outlying suburbs. And I have issues with that because I think those developments are actually not financially secure long-term. But it is worth noting, we do have current examples of cities bringing down housing costs through supply.
We have examples of markets bringing down.
Yeah.
Housing costs through supply, not municipalities commanding.
Okay, so I'm recognizing we're getting low on time. You have, I want to open it up to other comments, so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm scenario 3 was requiring, scenario 3 being mass building, I think we need that. Back what he's saying, we need more supply. With the requirement on size of the ability to incentivize and require these sustainability options. Kind of let the market decide. I think that's what we need to do, let the market kind of decide that. But I mean, going back to your sustainability incentives, we adopted, I think 3 years ago, a green MLS, so we do recognize sustainability options. That's only going to increase the price when appraisers look at that. I don't think sustainability is always the right answer. Just because, we're, since we've been a green MLS, we're putting more data into the MLS, appraisers do look at that. And they do, if they're comparing A and B doesn't have sustainability options, then when does, they're gonna increase the price. Just keep that in mind too, you guys are, that's important.
They increase the price of the one that had the sustainability.
Yes, exactly.
The value.
Yeah, the value of it, so that's only gonna, instead of driving prices down, we're now increasing prices.
We're pursuing some additional data to quantify that, if they rebrand sustainability, that we can, so that we can have a better idea of, are we talking about 4,000 or 40,000 or 400,000? Because
The data shows 20 to 50,000 if you read some.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the reduction in the ongoing costs, right? For those sustainability features may make the ongoing cost of that house much cheaper. So I don't know if that helps the selling point, like, yeah, there might be a higher initial upfront cost for something that overall will cost you less over time.
Are there any comments online, Adriana, from commissioners?
No.
I have a comment.
Oh, okay, Karen.
So I'm not quite clear on what you're wanting us to do today, and what is the next step?
I think, please, well, I think you have the slides. If you don't, we'll make sure that you do. There's the slide that Tiffany showed that had the decision point. If you could, each of you go through that and provide written feedback on that. Hopefully before February 4th, if possible, that we can kind of take in any comments you have before we go to council. If you can't meet that, why don't we just set that as the date, because I feel like it's a longer than that.
And then what are you trying to accomplish with council then when you present this to them?
We're kind of giving them the same presentation, and we're asking them to be on the same decision points. But if we can kind of guide that conversation from what we've heard from the other commissions that we've checked in with, just give them a pulse on maybe where we're at with who we've checked in with at this point.
But what direction do you want us to go in when we get the code recommendations drafted, right? So should we work harder on the incentives? Should we work harder on market production? Should we look at the combination of the sustainability features offset with market rate production? And again, we can counterbalance across, right? I mean, if you want to come back and say, I want it all, we'll try, we will try.
So I guess my challenge that I'm having is, this is such a broad
piece that you shared with us. And I feel there are so many little details that we don't have and don't know. So like when you talk about sidewalks, how much does that cost or
So I threw that,
reduce?
I just threw that one out.
That's, but I mean, I
that's
see there's hundreds of things
Yeah.
that are part of each piece that maybe this little piece is only gonna make a difference of $100, but this is gonna make a difference of $30,000. So how can, I just don't feel like I can make recommendations or give my opinions when I don't know what those things are.
So when you go through this document and you come through the back, there are a series of models where it's not perfect. It's not breaking down each one of those costs for you. It's more higher level of like, what's the end run? The differentials and price reductions, shockingly, they're not huge, right? Where we can move the needle is like $40,000-$60,000. It's not like $250,000 or anything like that, but it's worth looking sort of across the scenarios of what it's trying to show can happen. And it's surprising where they go. If that is of the biggest interest to you, that's where I would recommend looking at those models in the report.
And then I can just add one more thing about kind of how that information will be used. So like we touched on, the next step of this is the final code recommendations. And so this kind of this feedback of where the appetite is for the larger concepts that are outlined in the code concepts decision point slide. Then it kind of tells us, okay, there is an appetite for reducing street width. And then we start to follow that. There is an appetite for reducing or re-looking at the resource protection overlay. That tells us to focus on that. And then you'll see it again, we'll kind of be coming back with, here's the ways we could do this in code. And I think at that point, I think because this is a new project that I don't know that any city has done. So we're kind of learning as we do this, but as we kind of come back, we'll have more, I think of that more granular detail for that kind of conversation. I don't know if that helps kind of knowing.
Well, that does. I mean, I just feel like I don't want to make a recommendation now, but I have no idea what that does or doesn't do.
Yeah.
Is it possible for us to revisit kind of each of these items you've identified on a broad commission level? Like, I mean, so certainly all of us can email Adriana and then you get 12 different people saying, I like this, I need this, I like this, I need this. I don't know how useful that is for you. But if we looked at resource protection overlay and we can have a conversation as a commission to say, do we have any consensus on, would we support a reduction in the resource protection overlay in the residential zoning district? Yes, no, what are the questions? Parking, street widths, do we generally support street width reductions? Like, it feels like there's scenarios, but within those scenarios, there's specific trigger points that push. And I think those are more impactful to the zoning code revision than generally speaking, like scenario one. So can we have, would it be beneficial to you to get all of our individual feedback or to have a different conversation about each of those strategies and come up with a consensus or a recommendation?
I mean, I can come back every commission meeting.
Okay,
But
maybe I won't be
already-
at Dormy.
I am already actually on the schedule for next month to talk about missing middle, talk about those housing types, and to talk about adaptive reuse and single use residential.
Mhm.
So as much as like I'd like to pretend that we're not doing anything, I can't sit and wait any longer. So there are some things we are trying to move along forward, but we want to get that feedback from you all. But I'm happy to come and workshop. I'm also happy to sit with you all individually and workshop. This is all I do all day long.
I like that idea, Ivana. I actually think, because I mean, just thinking about this and sorry, you all, like I said, this is a big project and we're kind of running it. I think council is going to be no different. They're not going to be able to answer the point. So we're likely going to be visiting them the following month in a follow-up work session. So maybe that is just a good plan. If your agenda allows, why don't we bring this team back?
This is so critically important to housing and frankly, sustainability moving forward in a meaningful way in our community. That whatever time we need to allow to it, and if the workshopping each topic works great. This is really, housing staff is here. Planning has been coordinating this. We're participating in it, so I leave it to you, what your capacity is. I just want to be super clear. You did a great question as well of like, what's happening at council on the floor? And it's a gut reaction. We've been telling folks for a long time, we have some pretty difficult conversations coming. we're gonna decide this level, and then it's gonna filter down to, I mean, the conversation just as we get down to things like sidewalks and street widths, et cetera, are going to be detailed. And we're working that funnel down towards that as this team, this team gets a sense of kind of where the community thought process is. It is by no means, this is your only opportunity for input. And
No, not at all.
So,
So Commissioner Milazzo has a comment. I think the city needs to retain as much bargaining power as it can, which unfortunately is not a wholesale loosening too many code requirements except through individual development agreements. So those agreements can include affordability requirements.
I appreciate that. I would offer them that if it's a by right development, we don't have bargaining, and the only way we get this through changing code. And just for consideration. And I agree with that. So I think I could be comment being that we should retain as much bargaining power as we can and to not make, I think big wholesale changes to code. And my point was just that we only have bargaining power, the FTA development agreement process, when there's a zoning development, when someone's rezoning their property. When it's a by right development, we only can require what's in code. So I hear what that individual is saying, but I just offer the other side of that is that we have a lot of by right development and we won't get that bargaining if it's not development.
Well, I think that's important. Thank you for sharing that.
The other part of it too is the market is at such a place where, you know, what we've always considered to be holding zones, which was like rural residential, 1 acre minimum. That's not a holding zone anymore. People can go and build the houses at 1 acre minimum and make what they need to make. And we will lose out on the density that we need. And so we have to be careful with that bargaining chip, that we don't lose out on getting greater density because a developer doesn't want to bargain with us.
Okay, so knowing we're getting close on time, is there a path forward that we can direct staff? Do you all want to continue this conversation? Do you want to talk about these strategies one-on-one? Do you just want to give feedback individually? How does the commission want to move?
A comment, honestly, we're out of time, right? So there, I mean, and our next meeting isn't for another month. And so we either give individual feedback through staff so that they can feed it to them, but I don't know that there's because of what we're meeting was, I don't know that there's a way for us to consult together on this and pass ideas by each other.
Prior
Help
to
the consensus.
So if I can add something really quick, I think that what they're saying is that the presentation at council will be exactly like this one, asking for their feedback. But if we still want to meet next month with Tiffany coming back and have a broader conversation, that information will absolutely get back to council at a different point in time. Like the process is not over. Am I right?
Yeah, and so I just want to even just kind of maybe clarify on that. I think the whole team would come back, because I think that some of these issues you're going to need sustainability to inform your housing staff when you're really here. But exactly that, like I think like you guys have too much information to provide feedback today. Council's gonna end up having that same. I mean, I think what you're gonna see us do is go back and schedule to get on the follow-up council work session, so that will build in the time for us to come back. Or however, if you guys don't want to do it without us, but to have in your next meeting, the conversation about the decision points and talk through that. And then I have a feeling we'll be able to take that back and at the next council meeting, probably.
question,
March.
I can't offer your staff. Like could, but you can't listen. Is a working group an option?
Working group is an option. Yeah, it just might be harder to schedule than I've already scheduled.
I just wanted to.
So a working group would just have to remain below quorum, is that right?
Yes. Yes, or we could schedule specific housing commission meetings to have these topic by topic, if people are willing to dedicate the time to that.
You just, when you advertise it to
How many people are interested in seeing what quorum or not quorum?
I'm sorry, wait,
Council member present,
two brains.
house, that comment that night.
Oh, okay, Councilmember House.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Sarah. I liked the direction that you were going. I just wanted to also put out there for commissioners that are concerned about this coming before council, before you've had time to give further input. I would also encourage you to come to those meetings where it's scheduled for council and give your input there. It may not seem that we can really listen to or digest the information that you're bringing us at that time, but I personally am forming my opinions and forming my thoughts on different topics as we're having those conversations. So it's very important to me that you come and state your viewpoints. Take that 3 minutes of public participation during the conversation to share as much as you can. Email us in between and just make sure that your voice is heard as part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember House.
If I could just provide some suggestion in terms of thinking through your comments, think of the scenarios as strategies and what the outcome is. And yes, all of the details in between of how you get to that outcome are important, and we can continue to assess with you. But start to think about what are your priorities in terms of those outcomes. If that's the first place that we can get you to sort of formulate your vision, that will be the easiest, best place for us to move forward with. So if you can think, is it focusing entirely on those incentives? Is it the combination of sustainability and housing production and incentives? Is it just market rate production? You know, if you can sort of formulate, I think this is the target of where we want to go, we definitely want to increase housing capacity, then we can come back and work with you on the steps and focus in on that and not overwhelm you with 800 different ways.
Tyler, I think you have something to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, now we really are out of time, but this isn't really a productive comment, but I'm a little bit frustrated because, I mean, I've spent like 2 years doing my homework here for this moment to get feedback. And I feel like there are a lot of places where I feel like the project needs to step back and reconsider the direction it's going. There are a lot of places where I feel like the project is very focused on fiddling with the numbers around particular rules when there should be a broader discussion around whether these rules actually make sense. And I was really hoping to have this conversation in public ahead of the draft before this goes to city council, because I feel like after this gets going a little bit, it's going to be very hard to change the direction of this project. So I'm just curious your thoughts. I've got so much feedback on this. How am I going to give it to you guys? And I mean, I wanted to have this conversation in public, but I don't think that's going to be able to happen now. So.
We can make it happen.
Yeah.
It depends on the commitment level. Here's our challenge. It's a 2-hour meeting.
Yeah.
Had they presented less information, I think the feeling may be even more so that we don't have the information we need to make a decision. It is big. Totally get that it's big.
We will offer up that whatever works for you all. Yeah, we will make ourselves a special meeting.
We can do a special meeting. We could do a working group as long as it stays below quorum. We can do written comments that are then conglomerated. We're here to. We're not here to sing.
I have to pick up my kids, so let's be clear with
that. So I feel the desire, I hear the desire for more. We had an hour and a half plus for this, not enough time. If people want to come back in and we have a full commission meeting, or you'd rather do small groups and meet with staff that way.
So I guess,
We're up.
who's interested in having a further conversation, either in a working group or another public meeting? Okay, feels like all of us here, and again, so it feels like we have quorum then. So working groups out. So then we either do it next month or we look at a special meeting. And that seems to be like a logistics coordination that I would rely on staff to figure out. Is that okay?
We're happy to do that. I mean, I guess the question to you both is, do you feel that there's an urgency to get these comments within the next week?
No.
Before it goes to council, or can you guys come back at the next regularly scheduled meeting and we dedicate, maybe we push some items back, I don't know, but we dedicate a good chunk of time to
Well,
this.
it
We'll come back. I would rather, because in just this, I mean, so, last night at planning and zoning was the first time we gave this presentation. Okay. They also, planning and zoning commission was also, felt like it was a lot of information. That tells me that we're gonna hear the same thing, so let's just plan on, now, we will take the time to present to the council, let them know. We're meeting with different groups afterwards to get this feedback and they'll be back to report back. I think that's actually a better use of our funds. I don't want to complicate things, but I suspect when we presented sustainability tonight, they are going to have the same request. Would there be any appetite for having a combined meeting with sustainability and having this all in one discussion? Or is that just more of a logistical challenge and that we should just keep them separate? I just want to offer that in case it gets brought up to me. Sorry, go ahead.
Bring any commission member together wants to
Yeah.
dive deeper and do like a half day workshop or something.
I mean,
It would be long.
that would be long.
Instead of doing multiple follow-ups with every.
From a staff perspective, I would, of course, be open to it. What I'm hearing from the commission is that there is a desire for more housing-specific information to be conveyed and understood before participating perhaps in a larger discussion. Is that, am I reading that right?
Related, is that more housing related, or would it also involve sustainability?
Would also involve sustainability.
We're at your service. We can do an interim commission meeting like in 2 weeks and then also have them come back and break it out into those pieces for very specific feedback. We can seek a partner meeting with sustainability. It depends on where you are and what you want. We've heard loud and clear that there wants to be more involvement. That takes a different level of commitment from folks when the commitment when applying for commission is there's going to be one meeting a month, most months of the year. And so we are happy to dedicate more time to that, but also we're balancing that need to be respectful of your time as well and your ability to make a commitment to this. So I don't want to speak on your behalf that way.
Is there anything already scheduled in March that can't push? Or would be negatively impacted by pushing? I'm trying to think a separate meeting versus March already planned.
No, you mean February?
Oh, sorry, February. What month are we in? Yes, February.
The only thing we have on the February agenda is what Tiffany had mentioned. It's the ADU and then the agenda topics for last month. Oh, that's right. We were going to bring back the polling that you all did of the agenda topics.
But that's really a report out on scheduling and
Yeah.
that isn't.
Well, can that even just be emailed to us?
It could be there's a couple of discussion pieces, but not long, and that could be postponed because we're already starting to, several pieces of it, but we could.
I think some of it, I mean, depending on what some of those items are, could be very instrumental in this discussion too. I don't know.
Fair, having reviewed them, I would say they're not super in-depth relative to the level of feedback we're at now, because we're not down here in the funnel where they may be, where they can be much more impactful and have that direct impact on that discussion, because the feedback is, do we allow more trees to cut down, to allow more land use, that type of thing. We can work to balance that and we can send out those results of it. And if you see it differently, then. So.
Well, it's hard to get direction on code when you don't know, like, that's all I know is zoning code. So I get it, like, it's really hard to get that feedback back if you don't know what the full parameters of that code are. And I do have presentations that break down like resource protection. That's also something I can just send out if it's something you're interested in looking at. Or if there's places where you have specific questions, I can do like question and answer on code. Just to try to save on whatever time. So however you guys want additional information about the zoning code and how it operates, happy to do.
Yeah, my opinion would be anything you can send us that we could look at and digest in between the times that we meet would be extremely helpful. Because then at the same time that we're utilizing here.
Yeah, I feel horrible because we talked so long, because there was so much information and, really, we're here to engage you and to get your feedback. And we don't want to forward stick that conversation because you're the important part of how we need to move forward.
So do we feel like an hour's worth of discussion and feedback in February month, and then is sufficient to even provide the right feedback? And then, because if we're trying to get missing middle and
They overlap with this conversation.
the other one is the other thing, though,
It's
to
use residential and adaptive
to
reuse.
get that moving though.
But it overlaps with this conversation and I can do that.
Okay,
There's a benefit to having, actually, there's a benefit to having these two ordinances in this conversation
that's
at the same time.
so does that feel comfortable for commissioners that will discuss this in February? Give feedback to the council? And, yeah,
Not have a separate.
but not have a separate meeting? Or do you want to have a separate meeting beforehand and have them do a doodle, see when we're all there?
Can any commissioner just go to some of these other meetings and do publicly?
They are open, yes, they are all public meetings.
So, I mean, just do that. I mean, if you really have a strong opinion, want to go to those meetings, go. I think, right? Is that an option for them? Or
I think so.
So you go, but isn't there a little bit of a, like, you're kind of double dipping your public comments by like, oh, I'm represented on the housing commission and I'm also showing up at the sustainability commission.
We don't allow people to double dip.
I think you have to say you're there talking on behalf of yourself, not a member of the housing commission.
Yeah.
We could dedicate 2 hours next. We can even make the meeting longer. We can even start the meeting for next month. That's a good point. At,
12:30.
You could bring lunch.
Yeah, I mean, yes. We can bring lunch.
And thanks, Lee.
I'm not gonna make that as a promise, although,
Carrot sticks and dip.
We can have a cookie break.
we could do a brown bag, we could do brown bag lunch, everyone brings their lunch, and then we bring dessert, and we start at noon, and then we have 3 hours. If you all wanna do that, then we can.
Can you maybe ask in a doodle if that's agreeable to folks? And
Yeah.
and see if we'll have quorum.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it does.
Oh, that's smart, okay.
Yeah.
And Adriana, I'm gonna start sending you information just to send out.
Sounds
The
good.
piece of it.
I have about 2 or 3 emails that I'll be sending out to the commission already, just an FYI.
Is that next meeting, February? Oh, yeah, there you go, because, yeah. But if we're gonna do recommendations, we have that one.
I think so.
I don't think we're gonna have recommendations.
Because each piece is nice to
27.
Okay, so then that sounds like a path forward. Yeah, I'm getting head nods from staff, nods from staff and general commissioner agreement. Okay, excellent. Sorry to have to move us along, but I think y'all probably want to move along. Anyone online have a final comment, question?
Kevin Moses? Do we have any thoughts about brown bag lunch and Justina cookies? From her store. From her oven.
Made in a commercial kitchen, following standards. Right.
Nothing. Sam's Club cookies.
Okay, so then, thank you guys for being here. Thank you, commissioners, for the discussion. I appreciate it. Item 8, I believe the direction is that you guys will send us reports for these updates from Housing Authority Liaison. Hopefully, Moses, you're okay with that? And then anything from commissioners, other information from commissioners, I just want to open that up real quick. Okay, seeing none, we'll get a report from housing staff and I will adjourn us at 3:10. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay warm out there.
Thank you.
Bye.